coming up on Arirang News. South Korea announces that its own companies will compensate victims of forced labor under Japan's colonization during 1910 to 1945 rather than the accused Japanese companies. This, the government says, is to improve relations between the two countries, but is strongly decried by the victims and their families. South Korea decides to temporarily suspend its process of complaint with the World Trade Organization on Japan's export curbs of key industry materials. This as the two governments plan to launch discussions on returning to the state of play before July 2019, when the export controls were first imposed. More flexibility is to be provided for employees in South Korea when it comes to working hours. The government is reforming the current 52-hour work week, allowing people to work up to 69 hours per week during busy times, as well as go on long-term vacations. Good evening. It's 9 p.m. here in South Korea. Thank you for joining us on Arirang News. Today, Seoul took a step forward in improving ties with Tokyo by announcing its plan to compensate Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor. Instead of the accused Japanese companies, it'll be funded by South Korean firms. And this has prompted the leaders of the two countries, as well as U.S. President Joe Biden, to express hope of better bilateral relations. Our senior foreign affairs correspondent, Bae Eun-ji, leads us off.
In 2018, South Korea's Supreme Court made landmark rulings ordering two Japanese companies, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Nippon Steel, to compensate 15 Korean victims of forced labor during World War II. Foreign Minister Park Jin announced Monday that the South Korean government will compensate these victims using funds procured through a public foundation, called the Foundation for Victims of Forced Mobilization by Imperial Japan. The foundation will pay the compensation and interest on the delayed payment to the plaintiffs of the final rulings made in 2018, and it will also cover the compensation and interest for the plaintiffs of pending cases, if the court rules in their favor. Instead of the accused Japanese firms, Korean businesses that were beneficiaries of the 1965 treaty that normalized bilateral ties, including POSCO, will be making contributions to the foundation. Seoul's foreign ministry said the solution is aimed at improving relations between the two countries that have worsened since 2019, when the Japanese government imposed export restrictions.
We hope this solution serves to overcome the tensions between South Korea and Japan and pave the way for a new era. I think this is the last chance to do this.
He also stressed that forcing a new apology is not the key to resolving this issue, and that it's more important for the Japanese government to consistently and faithfully follow up on the apology it officially made in the past, referring to the joint declaration between the two countries' former leaders, Kim Dae-jung and Keizo Obuchi. President Yoon also said this was a decision to move toward a future-oriented relationship with Japan, and that this will open a new era of bilateral relations with Tokyo. In response, Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida welcomed South Korea's plan and said he hopes to improve ties by closely working with President Yoon Suk-yeol. Tokyo's foreign minister also said he hopes the solution will help restore ties between the countries, and said the Japanese government will continue to uphold the apologies it made in the past.
On this occasion, we confirm that the Japanese government continues to uphold the stance on historical recognition made by previous cabinets as a whole, including the joint declaration between Japan and South Korea made in October 1998.
In a statement, U.S. President Joe Biden also said this marks a groundbreaking new chapter of cooperation between two of Washington's closest allies, and that he looks forward to strengthening the trilateral ties. Bae Eun-ji, Arirang News.
Today's forced labor compensation proposal aims to mend ties between Seoul and Tokyo, but is strongly decried by Korean victims as it means Japan isn't being held accountable. Our Choi Min-jung has more.
All eyes are on whether South Korea's compensation plan for Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor will open up a new door to Seoul and Tokyo relations.
I hope that the Japanese government will carry on the spirit of the Kim Dae-jung-Obuchi Joint Declaration, which recognized deep remorse and gave a heartfelt apology for the entire colonial rule, including forced labor.
The joint declaration was adopted in 1998 by then South Korean President Kim Dae-jung and Japanese Prime Minister Keizo Obuchi, when the Japanese leader expressed remorse for the damage and pain caused to the Korean people. Pundits say relations could once again be restored as President Yoon is widely expected to visit Japan to meet his counterpart in March.
I think the deal is going to work as a catalyst, if you will, for two countries to patch things up and cooperate in more proactive manner on many issues related to North Korea, protecting and strengthening rules-based international order. But that said, I'm afraid that the deal is going to create big stir in South Korea's domestic political arena.
The victims of wartime forced labor and civic groups have been protesting against the government's plan, saying this issue cannot be resolved without sincere apologies and participation from the Japanese companies.
I just don't understand. I'm 95 years old and I've never seen anything like this.
We've been taking legal action for almost 30 years without any help from the Korean or Japanese governments. It's a shame that it had to end like this.
There is also a clash in South Korea's political scene. The ruling People Power Party said the decision was a solution that was thought through for the victims and stressed the importance of a trilateral relationship between South Korea, Japan, and the U.S. The main opposition Democratic Party described it as a disgrace and humiliation. Although the Korean government says it has left the door open for Japanese companies to contribute, the general sentiment is that Japanese firms will not make contributions to the foundation. Choi Min-dang, Arirang News.
In the meantime, Seoul and Tokyo announced a temporary halt to the WTO litigation regarding Japan's export curbs to South Korea, one of the issues that have further strained the bilateral ties for years. Our Shin Ha-young has the latest.
A silver lining for the South Korea-Japan trade relationship. South Korea and Japan decided to launch official talks on lifting of Japan's curbs on exports to Korea, which have been in place since 2019. According to a briefing from Seoul's Trade Ministry on Monday, South Korea announced temporary halt to its World Trade Organization litigation regarding the restrictions, which was compiled in 2019.
The two nations agreed to swiftly conduct bilateral consultations on issues about export regulations to bring the situation back to July 2019. South Korea's government decided to stop the WTO litigation during the talks. Japanese government will hold a policy meeting with Seoul on exports soon.
He added that the announcement was made by Japan's trade ministry simultaneously. Back in July 2019, after South Korea's ruling for the Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor, Japan placed restrictions on its export to South Korea. The export items included 3 major industrial materials that are necessary for South Korea's production of chips and displays. A month later, Tokyo also removed Seoul from its whitelist of preferred trading partners, triggering a strong backlash. In response, South Korea filed a complaint with the WTO over the trade dispute, claiming it was a discriminatory act that goes against WTO rules. Meanwhile, South Korea's trade ministry said that despite Japan's exports curbs, there was no delay in South Korea's production due to the government's fast response. However, the official added that reliance on Japan regarding imports of materials, parts, and equipment has plunged. The government is expecting to reduce such uncertainties among domestic firms by resolving trade curbs from Japan. The exact date of bilateral talks has not been decided yet, but Seoul's trade ministry said it will be taking place soon. Shin Ha-young, Arirang News.
The Yoon administration is seeking to allow for more flexibility in working hours so that people can work more during busier times and go on a longer vacations, aiming for a better work-life balance. However, this has to pass a threshold at the National Assembly. Lee Soo-jin with this report.
The South Korean government is aiming to enhance the quality of life for workers and help businesses grow by making changes to the current working hours system. Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho led an emergency meeting on Monday to address the revisions.
We will focus on making related laws and systems more flexible so that employees can concentrate better when they are working and can rest and use their vacation days more freely as long as there's an agreement between the employee and the management.
The government is making changes to the overtime work system, which many have criticized due to labor shortages suffered by smaller firms. Under the current rules, the maximum number of working hours is 52 hours per week, including 40 regular hours and a maximum of 12 in overtime. However, under the proposal, the overtime hour limit is to be calculated on a monthly, quarterly, half-yearly, or yearly basis, allowing companies to increase maximum weekly work hours up to 69 with a guaranteed rest period of 11 hours. Total overtime hours allowed on a monthly basis now comes to 52 hours, 140 hours quarterly, 250 hours on a half-yearly basis, and 440 hours annually. The nation's selective working hour system could also see changes. Currently, employees at companies where the system is in place can decide their start and finish times along with the number of hours they work each day, as long as they do not exceed the 52 hours per week limit for a period of 1 month. The government wants to extend that period from 1 month to 3 months to allow more flexibility. And the plans include further efforts to ensure that workers get enough rest time, with workers able to exchange overtime hours worked for paid leave.
The government intends to create a new working hour standard that guarantees choice, health, and rest in order to meet global standards.
The revisions will be submitted to the National Assembly for approval between June and July. However, it may not be easy for the reforms to go through, as the ruling People Power Party faces opposition from the Democratic Party, which currently holds the majority. Lee Soo-jin, Arirang News.
Findings for February show South Korea sees its slowest inflation in 10 months, falling below 5%. However, the rise in utility costs hits an all-time high. Our Lee Dae-young reports.
Consumer price increases showed signs of slowing in February. Statistics Korea said on Monday that the Consumer Price Index, a key gauge of inflation, jumped 4.8% on year last month. It's the first time in 10 months that the figure below 5% has been reported. Increases peaked last July but have started to see a downward trend since then. This month's deceleration was mainly due to a price drop in petroleum products and livestock goods. Prices of petroleum products dropped 1.1% compared to the previous year, marking the first time in 2 years that an on-year decrease has been seen. Prices of livestock goods slipped 2%, the first time in more than 3 years that an on-year drop has been recorded. Meanwhile, processed food prices jumped 10.4%, the highest increase since April 2009. Prices of services, including dining out, jumped 5.7% on year, the pace slowing down compared to January. However, public utility costs for electricity, gas, and water continued to soar last month. These three utility prices soared 28.4% on year, an all-time high figure since the relevant data was first compiled. Statistics Korea says with the water rates increasing in some cities and provinces, the overall utility price increase rose from the previous month. The official also says, despite the slower pace of inflation, the chance of some difficulties later this year remains.
As the government forecasted earlier, we expect some challenges in the second half of this year. Sluggish consumption may be one factor, while uncertainties regarding global commodity prices may arise due to China's reopening.
Meanwhile, according to Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho at a ministerial meeting on Monday, the government is aiming to stabilize the cost of utilities. The freezing of utility costs in the first half of 2023 had already been announced by the government. The Bank of Korea also held a meeting regarding consumer price rises on the same day. A central bank official says consumer prices will see much smaller increases in March as oil prices were too high for the same period last year. The figure is expected to remain above the government's goal of 2%. Lee Dae-hyun, Arirang News.
Earnings from Korea's entertainment exports set a fresh record last year amid the popularity of K-pop and K-dramas. Lee Seung-jae has the trade figures.
From BTS to Blackpink on the K-pop scene, and K-dramas like Extraordinary Eternal Woo and Squid Game, Korea's cultural content has been receiving a ton of love from fans and viewers worldwide. And thanks to this, the Bank of Korea announced Monday that earnings for all Korean entertainment content in 2022 came to $1.72 billion, up 47.9% from the previous year, setting a new record. On the other hand, South Korea's imports of similar content came to just $467 million, up just 9.7% from 2021. This means South Korea also saw a record trade surplus in the entertainment content sector, coming in at $1.23 billion. The South Korean entertainment industry has seen a steady increase in earnings since 2014, when it recorded an $80 million profit that rose to $245 million in 2015 and $520 million in 2016, thanks to the Korean wave boom in Southeast Asia and China. However, from 2017 to 2020, the industry saw a dip in profits as China boycotted Korean cultural content in response to the deployment of the THAAD system in South Korea. But thanks to the rise of OTT platforms and the power of social media, the K-content industry saw a huge surge in 2021 and 2022. And seeing the profitability, Netflix has continued to increase the number of Korean shows it plans to release on its platform, announcing plans for 34 shows in 2023 after releasing 25 in 2022. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
China has announced a modest target for economic growth this year at around 5% at the annual National People's Congress. Our Moon Hae-ryun has an analysis on what it means for South Korea's exports.
China's President Xi Jinping and top officials of the Chinese Communist Party walking into the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. The annual National People's Congress kicked off on Sunday, where officials have been approving key policies and will soon be approving President Xi's unprecedented third term in office. In the days to come, they're going to announce a new cabinet lineup, including a new premier, a new vice premier, and a new head of the People's Bank of China. In his final work report, outgoing Premier Li Keqiang stressed the need for economic recovery, expanding consumption, and creating jobs, while setting a modest growth projection for this year.
The main projected targets for development this year are as follows: GDP growth of around 5%, around 12 million new urban jobs, a surveyed urban unemployment rate of around 5.5%.
The growth target marks the lowest figure set by China since 1991, when the goal was 4.5%. This comes after the country's growth fell to 3% in 2022, against a projection of 5.5%. Analysts attribute the low growth estimate this year to low expectations for the global markets and to weak export growth. As a result, impacts on exports will be felt in countries around the world, including South Korea, as it exports intermediate parts to China, which is re-exported.
They will have less demand for Korean intermediate products, and that will make itself felt in Korea's total exports, especially intermediate goods like semiconductors.
The parliament session runs parallel to the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, which together make up the country's biggest annual political event, dubbed the Two Sessions. They usually last 1 or 2 weeks. The biggest item on the agenda is set for Friday. The Congress will vote on President Xi's third term, with all eyes on whether he can secure unanimous consent. The next day, Li Keqiang, the second most powerful person in the party and a close ally of Xi, is due to be confirmed as China's new premier. Moon Hae-ryun, Arirang News.
The American nuclear-capable heavy bomber B-52H flew over the western coast of the Korean peninsula as it took part in a joint drill with the South Korean Air Force. According to the South Korean Defense Ministry on Monday, the American bomber and the F-15K KF-16 jets flew in formation for a joint exercise. This is the first time in 3 months that the U.S. has deployed the B-52H strategic bomber to the Korean peninsula. The objective was to showcase the robust relationship and high caliber of the military forces of both countries, especially as North Korea continues to ratchet up its nuclear and missile threats. This air drill also comes a week ahead of the Freedom Shield, a South Korea-U.S. joint military exercise that's to be held on a large scale in years. In other news, the United Nations seals a deal on a critical commitment that'll seek to safeguard 30% of the biodiversity in the high seas by the year 2030. Lee Eun-jin reports.
A turning point has come for marine life in regions outside national boundaries, in areas known as the high seas. After 2 weeks of talks in New York, United Nations members have agreed on a unified treaty that will create a new body to manage the conservation of biodiversity across 30% of the Earth's seas. The agreement is the first of its kind since the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea came into force in 1994, a time well before marine biodiversity was established as a point of concern in terms of environmental protection. The latest move serves as both a historic milestone and a critical commitment in order to achieve the 30 by 30 pledge made by countries at the UN Biodiversity Conference in December to protect a third of the sea and its land by 2030.
Well, this is a historic milestone passed because this is a treaty that will enable protected areas to be created in nearly half the Earth's surface, which you couldn't do before. There was no legal mechanism of creating marine protected areas in what are called areas beyond national jurisdiction.
It's a very historic agreement, very exciting, and it will for the first time put in place a mechanism for creating these large marine sanctuaries in international waters, which is hugely important because right now only 1% of the high seas is protected within a marine reserve, and we need to get to 30% by 2030.
The high seas have long suffered exploitation due to commercial fishing and mining, as well as pollution from chemicals and plastics, which until now required global cooperation for marine sustainability. The treaty will provide a legal framework for establishing marine protected areas called MPAs and to protect against the loss of wildlife. It will establish a conference where parties will meet periodically and enable member states to be held accountable for issues such as governance and biodiversity. A huge achievement on a global front, but conservationists have highlighted some stumbling blocks. One of the biggest being the divide between developing and developed nations and how to fairly implement the treaty. Lee Eun-jin, Arirang News.
Unseasonably mild weather will continue for the next couple of days. Daytimes for most regions will be especially warm with highs exceeding the norms by about 10 degrees. Maximum temperatures in Seoul will be mild at 18 degrees. Other regions such as Gangneung and Daegu will be warmer with highs of 21 degrees Celsius. This is what we normally see in late April. And as warmer air continues to stream in, finest concentrations will also soar. For central regions, including Gyeonggi-do, Gangwon-do, and Chungcheongbuk-do provinces, air quality will be standing in the bad category. For Seoul, dust concentrations will temporarily soar for the morning and the evening hours. Make sure to have a mask that can filter out the dust particles, such as AKF94. And tomorrow, Seoul will start off at 6 degrees, Gwangju at 7 degrees. Highs in Seoul will get up to 18 degrees, Gwangju 21, Gyeongju will be very warm at 23 degrees. On Thursday morning, the capital region will see brief showers. Expect wide temperature gaps for the time being. That's all for now, and here are the weather conditions around the world.
That is all for tonight's newscast. Thank you for watching. Hope everyone has a great start of the week. Good night.